Good afternoon, and welcome to the second event in our Leadership webinar series, Corporate Leadership in an Era of Transformation, hosted by the Ihnatowycz Institute for Leadership at the Ivy Business School. My name is Gerard Seitz and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute. Before I say a few words about the Institute and our session this afternoon, I would like to first offer a few important thanks. First, a thank you to our esteemed panelists and moderator. I know there's many demands on your time as we continue to operate in a highly volatile world. I'm honored that you accepted our invitation to share with us your thoughts about leadership in general and the future of corporate leadership in an era of transformation in particular. We all look forward to hearing what I'm sure will be a revealing and insightful conversation. Second, our thanks to you, the audience. We warmly welcome all of you who tuned in today and were intrigued about how our guests view the changing role of business executives and the corporations they lead in navigating an uncertain and volatile post-pandemic world. And third, I'd like to extend my thanks to my Ivy colleagues, Kimberly Milani, Sarah McCabe, and our outstanding Ivy IT team members, Joe Rylett, Kevin Luton, and Gideon Gray. Putting the Leadership webinar series together is no small feat, and I want to ensure that today you, the audience, are aware of their dedication to curating and hosting this event. There's no longer any debate that the COVID-19 pandemic has had a significant impact on both business and society. It has indeed transformed how we live, work and play. There have been many conversations regarding the role business leaders can or perhaps should play in a post-pandemic world. So, to what extent do business leaders have a responsibility to commit to a stronger economy for workers, communities and other stakeholders, and lead the way to a more equitable and prosperous society? There's also a lot of rhetoric about the COVID-19 pandemic, which offers us a once-in-a-lifetime chance to reset, to make positive and profound systemic change in business and society. At the same time, however, there's a real fear that today's ubiquitous phrase, building back better, is becoming a placating catchphrase with no real commitment behind it, rather than what it needs to be, a mandate, a mantra that inspires reflection and spurs action in every sector and segment of society. So, are there any compelling signs that the corporate world is employing innovative thinking and taking tangible actions to contribute to transformational shifts that will make a positive difference now and in the future? And are the rest of us going to hold them to account? Have we also learned our lesson to extend the definition of value and wealth way beyond the economic and include health, well-being, climate, justice, and equity? And as an institute dedicated to the development of character in business leaders, we are certain that character underpins and informs any discussion on corporate leadership in an era of transformation. So, how can leader character serve as a common thread to help leaders and citizens alike weave a new, a better future? Our conversation this afternoon will be led by Dr. Laurence Mussio. Dr. Mussio is a business historian, author, professor, management consultant, and advisor to senior executives. He's a graduate of Western University, where he earned a degree in history from King's College. In October of 2018, Dr. Mussio co-founded the Long Run Initiative. The initiative is a forum for academic experts, business leaders, and public policymakers. It provides insights from the analysis of long-run experiences and trends to provide context and deepen understanding of the grand challenges facing businesses and government. In short, Dr. Mussio and his colleagues are at the Long Run Initiative focus on where we have been, where we are now, and where we are going. And this makes him the perfect host for this afternoon's conversation on corporate leadership in an era of transformation. Dr. Mussio will take about 10 minutes to set a context, to frame the trends and challenges of corporate leadership today, followed by a conversation with Darryl White and Malone. And hence, it is with great pleasure and gratitude that I now turn things over to Laurence Mussio. Laurence, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Seitz, and welcome to everybody to the Corporate Leadership in an Era of Transformation. I'd like to begin my remarks today by sharing a personal story. It was late in the evening on a mild mid-February night. The streets were surprisingly crowded. For so late an hour as my wife and I walked back from a party we won't soon forget. There's a picture of the party right there. In a city that is almost our second home. Of course, we had masks on and everybody did. But the February in question was in 2020. The city, Venice, the most serene republic on the Adriatic. The occasion was the famous Carnevale. The masks people wore were elaborate works of art, not the PPE kind. By the time we left the city the next day, news had broke that the rest of the Carnevale had been canceled. A deadly virus, you see, had been working its way from Wuhan, China, to claim more and more victims and dominate hourly newscasts. And as we know, there was no vaccine and no cure. It turns out we were in an early hotspot of the outbreak in Italy. That we were in a city that had invented the term quarantine, quarantena, was not lost on us. We miraculously escaped unharmed. And so, in days, it went from this and this to this and this. In the weeks following, much of the world began to shut down. It's now a year and a half that we're living with, and too many dying from COVID-19. I share that story because it is a kind of a micro illustration of how one era ends and another begins. One day you're reveling at a costume ball, and the next you're converting your laundry room to a long-term home office, stockpiling Cottonelle for some reason, sanitizer and masks, and having a much more intimate relationship with Amazon Prime that you ever thought possible. For leaders and systems, the onset of crisis caused the masks of competence and invincibility to slip, sometimes very badly. It also brought forth many examples of courage and strength, and we got to watch it all from lockdown. In all, the chain reaction between the pandemic, the host societies that affected, and their, let's call them underlying conditions, is the catalyst to this new era of transformation. That's the subject of our session today. So first, let's define the transformation and then look at the challenges for corporate leaders. Rhetorically, this transformation is defined by some catchphrases, as Gerard mentioned. Building back better seems to be popular. Reckoning seems to be gaining ground, but then so does the Roaring Twenties. In terms of substance, it's about health security, climate change, growing income inequality, racial inequality, indigenous relations, artificial intelligence, big tech, and on it goes. So the coming era looks a lot like the previous era, only, shall we say, on steroids. And right now, everything seems to be on steroids. The intensity of our debates and divisions, the stock market, economic growth, you name it. But the classic challenges that underpin the wealth of nations have not gone away. And we'll have to re-engage our attention, the productivity puzzle, innovation, inflation. Okay, that's the transformation in a nutshell. What about leadership? Everybody on this call who's lived through the last 18 months knows that the pandemic involved a fundamental test of leadership in crisis. Both public and corporate leaders were forced to confront the asymmetries of decision-making under conditions of uncertainty. A lot of it was painful to watch. Terrifyingly unprepared officials, many of them frequently wrong, but never in doubt. Many rose to the occasion, though. The economy shook, rattled, and rolled, but public policy acted relatively swiftly to protect us from the worst by firing essentially a money cannon in all directions. Incredibly, though, the North Atlantic world, if not Canada, developed and produced several effective vaccines in record time. All this shows that governments matter and that cooperation between the public and private sectors can be a formula for success if working collaboratively for the common good. In the United States, the economic recovery is so strong that one economist in the Wall Street Journal this morning suggested that it was without historical parallel, which suggests to me two things. One, a booming economy, and two, a pretty light understanding of the past. Our current state very much suggests that maybe what we've seen up to now is only the halftime score. And as my childhood idol, Harlem Globetrotter Meadowlark Lemon once said, life's most meaningless statistic is the halftime score. So we'll have to wait before passing definitive judgment, in other words. The pandemic was a short-term leadership test. Dealing with sustained change is a long-term one. For corporate leaders, I'm going to suggest we think about three grand challenges. Number one, the evolution of the corporation's public role and function. Number two, managing both risk and uncertainty effectively. And number three, building institutions that are at the least resilient and at best anti-fragile. Okay, one, corporate leadership's greatest external challenge to me is negotiating the evolution of its own public role. One recent Edelman poll suggested that 2/3 of Canadians believe that CEOs should step in when the government cannot fix societal problems. Okay, that's a potentially very big challenge, and it is new and unfamiliar territory for executives. Crossing that terrain requires a decision engine that generates a longer run view and a deeper context, not to mention the duty to balance interests. It also requires a careful respect for the traditions of responsible government and democratic accountability. Handing a massive amount of power to top managers seems out of step with the times, it would seem to me. Defining the outlines and the limits of this new role should be job number one, and it cannot be defined by default. For a while now, some corporations have been moving toward a major redefinition of the public corporation itself, reconsidering shareholder primacy and embracing stakeholder capitalism. And one way this idea is captured is the move toward using purpose as an organizing principle within the corporation. If the purpose movement is going to mean anything beyond a marketing slogan, this redefinition will require new structures, new measures of success, and especially a new mindset. Second, what are corporate leaders good at? Or what do we expect them to be good at? I mean, beyond profit making. In the long run, one big answer is managing risk and uncertainty. Success involves the willingness to take risks and to bet on the future. Proper risk taking is the basis of our productivity and progress. Corporate leaders need to foster, stimulate, and encourage that entrepreneurial spirit. The third and final point, corporate leaders are being challenged to help build institutions that are resilient and anti-fragile. And our guests today lead a company, for example, that's been in continuous operation since 1817. Now think about that, everybody. COVID-19 is probably their 10th pandemic, if you count all of the cholera outbreaks in the 19th century in this country. And as for eras of transformation over 2 centuries, their institution has seen all kinds. 4 industrial revolutions, depending on how you count, rebellions, financial crises, national and global military conflicts, and national and natural disasters, I beg your pardon. Now, it occurred to me in agreeing to do this discussion about our own era of transformation that we might be jumping the gun. I mean, the transformation is not yet over, right? Would you write the history of the Canadiens Leaf series after Game 4? I know some people would want to leave it there, déjà vu. Yet the act of thinking carefully about where we are right now and where we think we are headed can be useful. And I hope it's useful to all of you who've joined us this afternoon. So think of this discussion as a page in the diary of a journey already underway. And what better guests to discuss this transition, to take a step back and to reflect on our experience than 2 senior executives who have been at the front lines of Canada's corporate leadership response to the pandemic and in the vanguard of the transformation I talked about earlier. It is therefore my distinct pleasure to welcome Darryl White, Chief Executive Officer, BMO Financial Group, and Mona Malone, Chief Human Resources Officer and Head of People and Culture, BMO Financial Group. A very warm welcome to you both. And on behalf of the 800 or 900 viewers that are here this afternoon, thank you for taking the time to answer my sometimes impertinent questions. Now, we've got 5 rounds of questioning, just to keep it ginger, okay? The first deals with the lessons of the long and short run. That's round 1. Round 2, the changing role of the corporation. Round 3, internal challenges. Round 4, leadership, character, and context. Gerard will be happy. Round 5, the lightning round, where our guests are subject to rapid fire questions about randomly generated questions. Short answers only. I'd like to turn to you, Darryl, if I may, to begin with. Now, I've talked about the long run experience in my opening remarks, and it shows time and time again that disasters have profound consequences, economic consequences, political, cultural, and so forth. So it has been up and down the decades with the institution that you lead, and so it is with COVID-19. So as an opener, what have been your reflections? What key insights did you gain as a result of the massive problems and challenges and opportunities that the pandemic exposed, and perceiving all that in the context of a purpose-driven company?
Well, thanks for the question, Laurence. Before I dive into my attempt to address it, let me just say how nice it is to see you again. And it was very nice to see Gerard at the beginning again as he hosted this section. So thank you to Ivy for putting this on. I think it's an important conversation, and I know I speak for both Mona and I when I say that we're delighted to be here and have this conversation with you. And as for you, Mona, we only talk about 3 or 4 or 5 times a day. So to be able to do this with all of our friends at Ivy is just an incremental delight for both of us. On your question, Laurence, wow, if you start with what are your reflections on COVID, you can put a pretty wide blanket around that question. So I like the part that said, what are your insights? There I'll pick on 2 or 3, and they're not necessarily related, but I find them interesting. The first one would be around the power of human resilience. When you watch the adaptability and the agility of everyone and everything having changed overnight, you proved it in your remarks before with your very elegant, I must say, looking party in Venice turning into a nightmare overnight. But the adaptability that was behind that changed everybody and everything virtually overnight, and our behaviors included. And I found it, I look back now to 14, 15 months ago, I actually find it fascinating because we typically live in a world, all of us in our personal lives or in our institutional lives, of change is hard, change is difficult, people don't want to change, you have to be careful with the pace of change. And we proved that we changed instantly in that moment. And so I think it tells us something about our capacity and our capabilities being probably a lot more far-reaching than we really think they are. And we proved it in the moment. Why? Because of necessity. So if we kind of carry that thought forward, the capacity to do more than we ever thought possible and to change faster than we ever thought possible is probably a pretty important insight, at least as for me. Second one would be around the impacts of the pandemic on inequality. I think we can all agree that it's laid bare a lot of the inequalities, and the most vulnerable are proven to be the most vulnerable through the pandemic. Who got impacted the worst? Women, BIPOC, frontline workers. The list goes on, and here we see the most impacted on the pandemic impact itself, and so too is the case on the recovery. And so we've got a challenge, I think a very serious challenge in front of us to deal with, unfortunately, not the narrowing of the inequality conversation that we were having 3 years ago, but a widening of it. So there's some good news and then there's some bad news in what I've just said. And then I guess the third one, if you always want to come up with lists of 3, I suppose. But the third one might be, really a fascinating coordination story around remedies that involved both fiscal and monetary policy. So this is pretty unrelated to my first couple of points, but it's really fascinating. And having had the privilege of really a front row seat as effectively a consultant in conversations with central banks and politicians and policymakers, very early on we started to identify the need for the balance between fiscal, monetary. And here we're still living, of course, with both, and I think we will for quite some time. But we started to build that muscle in a coordinated way unfortunately, 13 years prior in the global financial crisis, we brought some of those learnings forward into this particular crisis, put them together. And I think the reaction was good then and even better now, because we did in about, 3, 4, 5 weeks what took 3 years in the global financial crisis, which is pretty interesting. So those would be three, not necessarily related, but pretty lasting impacts and insights from my own perspective.
I'll follow up a little bit later, but I'd like to turn to Mona, and thank you for agreeing to be with us in this hour. I'd like to pose essentially the same question to you. What do you believe COVID revealed about the strengths and weaknesses of our private and public institutions? What kind of lessons do you draw? Because you're really at the coalface. Your mandate is a little different than Darryl's, right? You're focused on HR, on people, on culture, and all of this came under the heaviest possible testing in this period. So what are your reflections on that?
Laurence, great to be here. And from a personal level, it was definitely not the first 2 years in the job that I ever anticipated. So I'm going to speak about this both in terms of at the organizational level, business level, what were some of the learnings, but also quite personally as a leader, what were some of the learnings that I took away. And I think on the business side, there's no doubt a crisis creates winners and losers in the marketplace. And taking time as a leadership team to make sure that we're learning through the experience of what's happening and dedicating time to both the urgent, important, and the strategic is really important. I think another reflection is how important partnerships and ecosystems are. And so when we think about what we're trying to achieve, how important those government partnerships, academic, supplier, customer, kind of as you think about the whole value chain, how you work across those ecosystems, and when you do it well, how you can achieve such greater outcomes. There's no doubt mental health has come to the forefront and will continue to be something that all businesses really need to be addressing as part of a core business issue, whether it's because of workforce productivity or just society more generally. And then I think on the personal side, what I've taken away is there is an enormous opportunity to continue to reinvent work and how we work. We proved that to ourselves. Darryl mentioned the resilience that we saw in our people, the creativity of our people in terms of how they reinvented ways of contacting customers, doing conferences, bringing marketplaces together. And I think that sense of creativity and innovation and really taking that forward is important. But I think we've also realized the value of human connectivity couldn't be greater. And when I think about the role that leaders play at times of crisis, people really remember how they felt based on the communications, the empathy, and the judgments that you make. And so I think that deep sense of individual leaders at any seat in an organization, you really do have an enormous impact on those around you, and they don't forget it.
Yeah, the institutional and individual elements are very much front and center for leaders and for virtually anybody, and who's involved. And so thank you very much for those keen reflections. We now go to round two, the changing role of the corporation. And back to Darryl. And my question would be, building back better. It was mentioned in Gerard's remarks, it was mentioned in my remarks as part of the rhetoric of this kind of era of transformation. And the question really is, are you seeing signs in the corporate world that might kind of contribute to lasting shifts or truly new innovative thinking? Or are we going to kind of go back because if the economy is good, then there'll be all good times, and then we can maybe go back to relaxing a little bit instead of having these very serious conversations about eras of transformation and so forth. So can you think of any concrete examples of, building back better, or what contributions of these actions making to building back better?
Yeah, I have a pretty clear perspective on this, Laurence. I think that The answer is, very, very little will be the same, frankly. I think that, do I think there's going to be an economic tailwind? You bet I do. Do I actually think that it's going to be one of those that causes us to be able to, I think you said relax. I don't see that in sight for quite some time, because I think the complexities of how we're built back and how we choose to build back are real, and they'll happen in small ways and big ways, i.e. what will be different on the from to. And I'll give you a couple examples. Like on the small ways, the things that we do every day. I think the change in technology enablement, the acceleration on everything that we choose to do, the way we're doing this meeting right now, we would be doing this one in person, but there's others that we would not. And we've learned a lot about efficiency and productivity through it. Workplace transformation. Mona and I spend time talking about this virtually every day, and thinking about how it's not just the tools that we use, but the work that needs to get done, how it gets done, where it gets done, by who it gets done. This has really forced a lot of learnings on us. That's not just consultant speak, if I could put it that way. It's real because we're observing it. I think one of the risks that we all have on the productivity gap, Laurence, and you're a student of this as well, which is something we really have to address in this country, in Canada, is that we don't bottle it. We don't bottle the learnings that we've had. We were very, very, very productive in crisis. I already have moments today where I say, oh my gosh, we've slipped back to that relax, as you call it, or that complacency. There will be what I call sector innovations. When we look at our clients, we look at the businesses that we serve and the various sectors that we serve. Some things will kind of revert back a little bit, but some won't at all. I mean, are you actually not going to ever use meal kits again? Are you not going to ever have a Zoom call again? I remember when I was trying to figure out how to download Zoom onto my phone. Of course not. Those things will change. So small things, big things. But the big things, though, I would say, with this tailwind of economic growth, and when I talk about a tailwind, by the way, I talk about 6-7% GDP growth in Canada and the US this year, maybe 4.5, 5 next year. That is, you called roaring 20s before. It'll be different because the adaptation on the underlying platformization of everything we do is changing. But that is a serious tailwind. Think of a coiled spring unlocking. The two big things that I think happen through that building back that rise to me above all others, and Mona and I talk about this at the executive committee of the bank often, and I'm almost obsessed with this, I must say, is the first is the digitization of almost everything. I call it the digitization of almost everything. And I don't mean just how you consume something on your tablet or on your mobile. I mean end to end, all the way through how we do work, who does it, what we invest in, how we make things safer, more secure, less expensive, more convenient, all at the same time for internal consumption, customer consumption, the digitization of almost everything. And of course, the second is sustainability. We saw a great acceleration through the crisis and continue to. Your analogy of us being at halftime, I think, is in the right zone. In fact, I would say we're probably at quarter time, not even half. And as our chief sustainability officer likes to say, the most important letter in ESG is C. It's climate, and the acceleration on the climate file, overdue. Here we are. We've done a lot at our own institution, I'm proud to say, and we've got a lot more to do. But we're seeing it everywhere we go, everywhere around the world with our clients, and we've made a commitment to be our clients' lead advisor in the transition to a net zero world. So think about those words. They're pretty important, and we try to live up to what we say. And we've made commitments on net zero, on 2050, on targets in between. And we're not alone in that. And there's a lot of work going on, I would say, on that file. Like the digitization, people talk a lot about digitization having brought forward 5 years worth of advancement. I think we've brought forward 5 years worth of work, good work, and plans on climate and sustainability as well. But not just plans to have a plan with measurable outcomes that we're accountable for. That's been a big change through the pandemic. And I think that's part of the building back. Is it better? Yes. It's not just a catchphrase, though, in those two files. It's real. It's actually happening right in front of us, and we're all accountable to deliver it.
It seems like we've maybe learned from the past a little bit that to seize the opportunity and make say more durable commitments and durable institutions and plans. So thank you very much for that. Mona, you've been staking out ground in the last year and a half on the future of the public corporation, which is kind of in many ways connected with what Darryl has just been saying in very serious ways. You know, what it's going to look like, what the role of the public corporation might be, how it's evolving, and why. And I just wonder what your thoughts are on the, you know, on the future of the public corporation coming into this era of transformation, and why is there this kind of movement for change in the form of the corporation, what it does and what it means to us?
And Laurence, I think what's really important there is you said the why, and I'm going to start with, you know, why is more needed? And I think, you know, I feel like the answer is all around us. Governments, corporations, schools, universities, associations, community groups, we are all being asked to help solve some of society's biggest challenges. And I think, you know, you articulated them well at the start of this, whether it's climate, whether it's social injustice, whether it's income inequality. And it's because these are complex social problems that require a lot of leadership, and a lot of leadership that needs to come from more than one seat. So I think that's the why. Then the question is how, and the how is a lot more challenging. You know, I think one of the hows is for companies to develop an approach to be a purpose-driven organization. I know that for us, that was a really important insight learning. And this is not about a marketing slogan or something that you put on your wall. When I say purpose-driven organization, it's really thinking about how can your organization make an impact in society to make things better for the biggest problems to all stakeholders. And so I think one, that deep insight, and then recognizing that the actions the organization takes, the actions in terms of where they invest, the actions of individual leaders are what brings this to life. And so the DNA of the leaders then links to this concept of, you know, do they exhibit the behaviors that actually line up with what society cares about most? And are they taking action on those things individually and collectively? And so this concept of purpose to me is really important, and also a view of not necessarily going it alone, because it's not about dominance in one of these things. It's about progress, and progress only comes through cooperation. And that's where you get the sense of the need to partnership across different types of organizations.
Laurence, could I come in on this with I think a bit of a compliment? I think Mona's done a tour de force answering your question on the role of the corporation. But the only other perspective I wanted to add was I think Canadians should be very proud of where we are. We are not perfect in the way we run our corporations in Canada, but we have a distinct position relative to many jurisdictions in the world. And at the company that Mona and I lead, we have the privilege of operating in over 25 countries, and we spend a lot of time in Canada and the US, for example, and 40% of our business, frankly, is in the US. So we have quite an interesting front row seat on this question as we serve companies all over the world. And here I would say to you, it's quite interesting, wasn't it, a couple of years ago when the Business Roundtable in the United States took the initiative, a good initiative, to talk about stakeholder capitalism and talk about the imperative for boards and management to consider the objectives of not just shareholders, but customers, employees, communities, suppliers, and the list goes on. And it was equally interesting to see at that time that the equivalent bodies in Canada, the Business Council of Canada, for example, didn't put out an in-kind statement. I serve on the Business Council in the US, I serve on the Business Council of Canada. And one of the reasons for that is because most Canadian companies said, well, gee, for the most part, we kind of think we're already there. Now, we're not perfect. We had a lot to do. When I say we, I'm talking about the broader ecosystem. particularly of public companies in Canada. But there is some truth to that. There was a distinct difference. And in fact, we are already there in case precedent in law in some respects, because it was declared by the courts in the BCE judgment about 13 years ago. More importantly, though, an increasing number of companies are there in practice. And so when Mona described a purpose-led organization, in our own case, I remember all the work we did to declare our purpose. We define our purpose as to boldly grow the good in business and life. One of the things that was fascinating for me and a learning for me as we went through it is most of our employees, we did this ground up work, said to us, we want to make sure we come up with something that isn't just a marketing phrase, as Mona said, and expresses who we are, not some signpost of who we might become in 5 or 10 years. Put words around what we already think we stand for. And so I think Canada does this very well. I think a lot of companies do that very well. They consider the broader ecosystem, the complexities of those ecosystems, and we should be very proud of that in this country. I think we should hold ourselves out as leaders in the world as far as stakeholder capitalism is concerned. It's not new, it's not novel. It's been around for a very long time and is taking shape more actively today.
Darryl, are there any shadow sides to that stakeholder capitalism approach? I mean, when you're talking about the role, what you're talking about is maybe an expanded role of business executives in the, beyond the classic role, right? And as you say, this has been happening for a long time. It's not suddenly that we woke up in a pandemic and decided that, corporate leaders had to think about not just their company. But I just wonder, are there, in terms of, are there any, let's say, tensions or dangers or things that maybe to watch out for on the road to kind of trying to balance those interests?
Well, I think about it as social license, Laurence. I'll tell you a couple of stories. When I've been in my job only almost 4 years. When I came into my job, one of my jobs is to meet with our owners, our shareholders. I would say to you, the topic of your social license, whether it be environmental, social, governance, would come up in 1 in 10 conversations. 2 years later, it was probably 5 in 10. Today, it's 10 for 10, right? So we know that there's a shareholder imperative that is omnipresent, I would say. But then I think the risk that you might be alluding to, where the tension comes in, is you have to think about, as a management team, as an executive team, where you plan to lean in. And what's your rubric? What's your algorithm to decide where you think you can have an impact? Does it intersect with your values? Does it intersect with your footprint? Do you have precedent? Are you best placed to speak up and step in? And often the case when you run big organizations that have accountabilities to a lot of communities, the answer will be yes. And occasionally, though, it will be no. And you have to recognize that you will not be very good at solving any problem if you think that your accountability is to solve all the problems. And so knowing where you can make a difference, where you can speak up, and where you can lean in, and making some tougher choices as to where you frankly can't, that's kind of the answer to your question. That's where the tension comes in, and that's where it becomes a more difficult decision.
And that, I guess there's a supplementary question to maybe one or both of you, but Darryl, maybe you could take this on about the on how the decision-making engine. You say you're almost 4 years into the top job, and the decision-making engine requires a different type of horsepower and a different type of approach in in this kind of expanded role. So how can we improve the quality of judgment? This is round 3 is about internal challenges. So how can we improve the quality of the quality of judgment in terms of the decision making? Given because there's so many issues. It's not just economic issues. It is political. It's social, and all of those things. So I imagine it's maybe one of those kind of ongoing challenges. Yeah.
I was just going to jump in on this concept of, how do you make sure that you're making good decisions? And I think, there are some principles, right? Are you learning from the experiences that you go through individually and collectively as an organization? Are you making sure you get inputs from multiple places to make a decision? And that may sound far easier than it actually is. in practice? Because I don't just mean, are you getting inputs from good data and insights, but are you getting inputs based on the judgment of different people around you? Are those people diverse? And have you created the conditions where they feel that they can speak up and be candid? Because it's not just a command and control environment. You really care about the level of engagement and the intellectual horsepower they bring in terms of their judgments and their perspectives. And do you listen to those and consider them when you're making your final determinations? And is that happening at multiple levels across your organization?
Laurence, I think Mona hit the nail right on the head, because the two themes that to me emerge right to the top when we think about the quality of decision making, and it's been, frankly, it's been a learning journey for me as well, are this notion of, have you got all the right voices at the table? And it might be that you think you do, but your blind spot is the answers are somewhere else and you actually haven't brought them to the table. So diversity comes in many respects, right? It can come in, the right voice to answer a certain question might be the person that joined the company last week because they have a fresh perspective, an objective perspective. So that diversity has to take on a lot more complexity and a lot more layers than you might think on the surface in order to get the right input into the decision being the output. And the second is the quality of the use of data and predictive analytics and decisioning is so important and increasing in importance. We have conversations around, the leaders tomorrow, are they going to be the generals of the army, or are they going to be the drone pilots who can design and run a scientific project? And the answer is, of course, there will be requirement for everybody to learn to be both. And that's where it gets really hard. And so you need to be able to lead, and hopefully one day we'll be able to lead without being holograms as we are today. We'll be back to a place where we can lead in person. But you're going to have to also rely, particularly in an increasingly complex world, on really smart data analytics insights, not just what you see at the desktop on your spreadsheet. It's really going to end up having to be both. Yes. And we're already there, I think.
Yeah, no, it is such an important question that doesn't often get asked because we're focused on the issues. But I'd like to turn now to Mona just for a moment, because and just to kind of elaborate a little bit, because you're the head of people and culture, so you've got to, this essentially the pandemic has renewed the spotlight on corporate culture, its flexibility, its adaptability, its resilience, and so forth, its readiness, and there seems to be a lot of demands on that on that file, on that culture, and I wonder what are there kind of polarities or tensions that need to kind of be reconciled? Of course there are. Otherwise we wouldn't be, we would be dead, because that there are divergent interests and so forth. But what are the polarities, challenges, and let's say, I don't know, opportunities in shaping a coherent response to these contemporary demands from maybe a culture perspective or purpose perspective?
Well, and I think what resonated most, Laurence, in your framing was the concept of a polarity, because they are everywhere, right? They're everywhere for us as leaders, whether it's short-term, long-term, whether it's, is there a polarity between the sense of purpose and multi-stakeholder versus profit? That's debated. And so I think, if you get too narrow in it's this or that, the choice, that's what I think is really limiting. And when you think about the nature of a real polarity, it's thinking about how can you solve in a broader sense? How can you solve and reframe what the problem statement is? And I think, what we're seeing in society today around climate gives me actually great optimism. The concept of how can corporations, how can banks, how can we really help our clients in light of the climate challenges? How can we be their partner in transitioning? How can we be their partner in solutions? How can we think about growth opportunities for our organization, while also advancing and helping society with one of the most pressing problems that we have today and most complex problems. How can we be a shaper of systems around capital to businesses that are owned by women, businesses that are owned by Black entrepreneurs? How can we think about improving society and think about business growth? And I think, to me, that way of thinking and creating broader accessibility and broader inputs has been something that's really important, but I think we need to do way more of.
I think that's it kind of hits the nail right on the head in terms of what those tensions and polarities are. And it's the work is never quite completely done, because there are continuously evolving interests and issues and so forth. But if there's a framework, then this is something new, and maybe contributes to that resilience that we talked about a little bit earlier, that anti-fragility. So now we go to round 4. Okay, character. It's the character round. So I'm sorry, Mona, but I'm going to have to come back to you, because you're the chair of the advisory council for the Ihnatowycz Institute for leadership at Ivy, of course. And the Institute, as most people know on this call, on this webinar, aims to develop global citizens who have strength of character and so forth. How does character fit in? Is it, because sometimes when I hear about character, let's say talked about, it seems like it's rather theoretical, or it seems rather general. Okay, Gerard's going to kill me. He's like, no, there's a whole literature on it, of course. But how does character fit into the discussion on corporate leadership in an era of transformation?
Yeah, and this is an area that I'm really passionate about with a deep belief. And so I think, whether it's leading a bank, whether it's in a government office, whether it's in an academic organization, the challenges leaders face are more complex than they were a decade or two ago. And I think the concept of leadership character means that you're really thinking about not only some of those traditional leadership traits that we've often talked about, drive, accountability, which remain very, very important, but you're also taking into consideration humility, humanity, empathy. And again, it's not only those traits, it's the combination of those two things together. And so when you think about that, you're dealing with the most complex problems, you're dealing with a very complex ecosystem, and that you're dealing with both data, complexity of domain or subject, with people, and really getting a whole slew of people to move in a certain direction in a coordinated way and get the best from them. This concept of understanding character as part of it, and for companies to think about their leadership frameworks, including the concept of character, I think is really important. And if you think about that, going back to being a purpose-driven organization, to be a purpose-driven organization means the actions of individuals can have an enormous effect on the company as a whole. That could mean that it's a sales rep in a particular location that you have across the country. It could be a leader 4 levels down from the CEO, or it could be the CEO themselves. And this sense of creating a sense of, what really matters to be a leader in the place is really important. And having a character-based leadership framework is one way that I think you can really powerfully do that.
Darryl, did you want to add something about character? Because I know that you have to exhibit it every day in a highly public way, right? And then also it's interstitial with everything you do and the judgments you make. Character in leadership in the post-pandemic world.
Yeah, well, it's hard to round out Mona's dissertation just now, Laurence, because I've learned more about the study of character from Mona herself than anywhere else I go. I will say, though, the crisis was an interesting test of character. And, I've developed a point of view where, a lot of people who, you talked about catchphrases earlier, who like to say that that character is developed in a crisis. And I think that that's dead wrong. I think that character is revealed in a crisis. I think you build character through your life experiences, through what you believe in. And it's a lot of reps in a lot of different situations in life, easy ones, hard ones. And then crisis comes along and character is revealed, and almost every single time. So I think Mona's exactly right in her framing of the importance, including her point on humility. But I'm just adding to that the really interesting time where you know where it is and where it isn't is when the pressure cooker's on and you see everything completely unveiled.
When the heat is on, then that's when character will out, I suppose. And that is, and so we've had an example of that in the last maybe 18 months. But I would probably imagine that it would probably be between February of 2020, when I was coming back from Venice, and all of that stuff hit the fan, and maybe September, where everybody was at action stations. And so that must have been a pretty intense experience. Just never mind the issues. I mean, like personal wise, it must have been an incredible revelation and growth. And yeah, so it's it's a pretty amazing time. We have a final round, and it's a lightning round, and both of you are advancing to the lightning round. I'm happy to say. And I'm going to ask you.
We made it,
Yeah,
Mona.
Exactly. Yes.
Wow.
At least for this hour, I get to be there. Okay. So I'm going to ask you some very short answers, one word or sentence. Some are serious, others are important, one or two are frivolous, but all of them are in some unspoken way related to the theme of leadership and change, or maybe not. Okay. So I'm going to go with, I'm going to go with Mona first. Overrated or underrated? The G in ESG. Is it overrated or underrated?
Underrated, but I'm going back to what Darryl said. Our favorite letter in ESG is C for climate.
Darryl? Threat of inflation, overrated or underrated?
Oh, we could spend the rest of the day and the week on this question, but you wanted one word, I'll give it to you, underrated.
Underrated, yes. That's the correct answer, actually. Yes, I've been drumming that. I'm the part of the Larry Summers group. Mona, over to you. Is intuition overrated or underrated? Intuition.
Intuition, I would say underrated, but if you think about instinct as judgment based on past experience, but with a sense of openness.
Pretty impressive, actually. Darryl, gross domestic products statistics. Okay, GDP statistics, you see them all the time. Underrated or overrated?
Statistics.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, I'm going to bifurcate your answer. I know you don't want me to do this, but I think the statistics themselves, because of the measurement tool, are overrated. I think the current forecasts are underrated, because that's the other side of the same coin of the inflation question you asked me a couple of minutes ago.
You're saying that we're underrating the potential of growth, but the tools that we use in measuring GDP, or the basket of GDP, they probably are maybe a little bit overrated or fetishized or whatever it is.
Well, if they were developed any time before 5 years ago, they're missing a pretty big portion of the equation, and that's the problem.
Exactly. Very satisfied with that answer. Mona, Midnight Oil or Tragically Hip?
Oh, Tragically Hip, Canadian, fantastic music, and Gord Downie really concerned himself with First Nations and Indigenous issues. So that's inspiring.
Okay, but Midnight Oil also did. I mean, they were among the first. And, yeah, I mean, the hip, I mean, what can you say? Showing the flag, fantastic. Darryl, Coldplay or Drake? Coldplay or Drake?
Oh gosh, You probably want me to go with the Canadian answer. Simona,
No,
this
no,
is the
no,
time.
no.
This is the time. This is the time in the session where when he's telling us there are wrong answers. You know, I have to go to my tastes. I have to go to my tastes on this one, Laurence. Coldplay.
Okay, all right, all right. You know, this is a judgment-free zone. You know, it's like, but yeah. So, Mona, this is a little longer question, and probably the answer will be shorter than the question. If you'd challenge yourself to identify something that's going on in Canada or the world about which to be optimistic, what would it be? If not for you, but maybe for your children?
Well, this is, I think, couldn't be a more timely question. I have 3 children that are 18, 16, and 14. And some days I do feel the need to really think about the level of optimism. And when I see the focus that they have on many of the things that we've talked about today, when we think about climate, when we think about social injustice, when I think about the openness and the lens that they have, when I think about what they have had in their education versus perhaps what I had versus what my parents have, what my grandparents had, I am optimistic. I think that youth bring an opportunity for higher openness. And I think their awareness of the issues that matter most are greater at a young age. And I think the technology advancements that we really are seeing and the pace of those advancements in connection with the talent that's out there gives me great optimism for the future.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you very much. Darryl, you get the last question, and it's about artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence in financial institutions, overrated or underrated?
Oh, are you kidding me? You're going to give me that question, and after Mona's tour de force just a minute ago. I mean, think about this. I have to follow that tough act every day. Artificial intelligence, overrated or underrated? Is that the question?
Like in financial institutions, because you know, we may
Yeah.
have talked about this before, but you know, AI, are we heading toward, is it actually being underestimated in terms of the potential for change, or is it kind of overrated? Even AI itself is often seen, people are saying, well, there's going to be a singularity in about 20, 40 years, whatever. And that seems a little bit overrated, but I don't want to prejudice your answer, but artificial intelligence, in terms of where it's at right now, is it overrated or underrated?
Yeah, I'm going to pick another word. I'm actually going to make up a word because I don't think it's overrated or underrated. I think it's understood. If
Yes.
my grade school English teacher mother were here, she would say that's properly said misunderstood. And the reason I say that is because the benefits are really, really fascinating. I mean, we could go on all day, and Mona and I could sort of peel back the onion for you here, but the benefits that we can find when we identify for an individual customer with pattern recognition trends that can keep them out of trouble sooner with solutions sooner, and that's done by a machine that can't be done by 100 humans for 50 years because it understands not only the pattern of that particular consumer, but the database of, in our case, 15 million consumers. That's pretty cool. That's really powerful, and that can change the life to the better of that person. We can also use tools to predict bad outcomes in society as well when you scale those types of analytics. So I think it's understood because there's a lot of good that comes from using AI the right way. And I'll leave it there. I think we're up against the clock, but that would be my answer.
Yes, indeed. I will accept that answer, though you've
That's kind of you.
none of the above. But it actually delivered a lot more knowledge and insight on it. So thank you very much, and I thank you. And on that bombshell, we have to close for today. And I just like to take the opportunity to thank both you, Darryl, and Mona for your honest and forthright and considered answers to what I said before might have seemed impertinent questions, but I think they're important to to ask some of the more difficult questions about, about leadership. And it's part of the social responsibility, if you will, of, in the 21st century of executives. And you demonstrate that every single day, both of you, in different ways. And so I thank you very much indeed for joining us today. And all the best to you both. And I'll hand it back to Gerard if he's there, if he hasn't.
I'm here.
Okay, there you are. Okay, so I'm going to stop my video. It's hard for me to do, but I'm going to do it. So thank you.
Thanks, Laurence. We have a few minutes, and so Laurence, you talked about impertinent questions, and so maybe I can ask one of those impertinent questions, because Darryl, this has been a great conversation, very optimistic. I think you're a great champion for BMO and a great many Canadian organizations. The reality also is, though, that Canadians keep hearing about low trust in financial institutions. There's almost like daily stories. And so, Darryl, how is that possible? Is this a marketing issue? Is this cranky reporters? And so how do you fight against that deep sense of trust that seems to exist, at least with a fairly sizable part of Canadian population?
Gerard, it's a good question, and I don't mind you asking it at all. In fact, I'm glad you asked it. I think that your question falls inside the frame of trust in institutions broadly, whether they be government, business, even academia, I dare say. And I think we all have an accountability to engage in that conversation as to why that's the case. So environmentally, I think we all understand the forces that we've seen around the world with the benefits of globalization, the detriments of globalization, the benefits of the digital acceleration, the detriments of the digital acceleration, and then the profound conversions that we've seen at the geopolitical level as a result. So what happens is you get a lot of people who are questioning trust in institutions broadly. Interestingly, I guess, Gerard, it would depend on the survey that we would look at, wouldn't it? But if you look at the Edelman surveys, while trust in institutions has declined broadly, the trust in corporations is higher than other institutions today. And so that to me is actually quite fascinating, which tells you, kind of goes back to the questions that Laurence was asking earlier. What are the expectations? And what are your expectations to deliver? And I can tell you, in the institution that I work for, we spend more time talking about the social license imperative than we do talking about the profit imperative. We feel it very deeply. Whether consumers feel it as well as we try to deliver it is an accountability, I think, that we have, and probably we're somewhere on our journey, but certainly not in the end zone on this particular question.
Really appreciate it, Darryl. Thank you for that. Mona, I got a final question for you as well. I don't think it's nearly as complex. Mona, I heard you talk about kind of the importance of connectivity in organizations. I know that at BMO, the organization care deeply about kind of the core values. And for me, culture is always our values in action. And so here's a question that I've received often from people in executive education. They say, how are we going to nurture this organizational culture when so many people are away from the office, where kind of there's no real connectivity? And so what is happening at BMO to make sure that culture, that core value set is alive and well every single day, especially during a crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Gerard. And I think most business leaders have been worried about mentorship and the long-term impacts on their culture of people being remote. And I think what's really important is recognizing, while where people's physical location is one dimension of culture, how you bring people together, the connections and the type of conversations they have is another very important piece. And so during the pandemic, the leaders that check in on their teams, that know about what's going on in their team members' lives, that openly don't just talk about work, but they check in, what's happening with them. Because I don't think there's been a person on this webcast or any of us individually that hasn't been touched by the pandemic, whether it's death of a loved one, whether it's illness themselves, whether it's a mental health challenge with somebody that they know about or a family member. And so we all have that, and bringing this concept of, at BMO we could say in business and life, this sense of we are who we are, and managers being able to understand what's going on in the lives of their employees and being able to have candid conversations about that, which then means that there's a level of trust. And only with those conditions do you then really be able to foster anything from that. And so I think an element of culture that's really important is if you have those kind of relationships in the organization. And that's when I think, when tough things happen, whether it's the pandemic or whether it's quite honestly, what we've seen in Kamloops with the absolute tragedy, and being able to have candid conversations that include tears, sorrow, and anger, with employees, and being able to talk about what can we do? What can we do individually? What can we do as an organization? How can we be part of a ripple of positive change is so important. And to me, that is culture. It's when you're taking things that are business, customer related, and you're talking about what's happening in society and life and having those real conversations.
Appreciate it, Mona. Thank you so much. And so on that note, I would like to thank Laurence, and also thank Darryl and Mona for a great conversation. You certainly gave us much to reflect on. And thank you to you, our audience. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation as well. We look forward to seeing you on June the 15th for our next session, entitled Racism is Our Pandemic, featuring Wes Hall, who is the Executive Chairman and founder of Kingsdale Advisors, and of course the founder of the Black North Initiative. The conversation will be led by Janine Pereira, who is the Director of Talent Development at EY Canada. Of course, we'll send you a link for registration in a follow-up email that includes also recording of this particular session. Of course, you can also check us out via our website, ivy.ca/leadership. For now, enjoy the rest of the day, stay safe, and be well. Take care.